the Baltic fleet, bristling with radar stations, slowly running out of fuel. Not because of a battle, a decision made in a small Baltic nation that most people couldn't even find on a map 2 years ago. That's what's happening right now in Kaliningrad. And it tells us something enormous about the nature of power in the Middle East. If you're new here, this is where we break down the world's most complex conflicts and geopolitical stories. No spin, just depth. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that one are exactly why this channel exists. Let's get into it. Kaliningrad, officially the Kaliningrad Oblast. A Russian region of nearly 1 million people, roughly 15,000 square kilometers, west east. It has no land border with Russia itself. None. Zero. To get there overland from Moscow, you need to cross Belarus and then either Lithuania or Poland. 2 NATO members who, to put it with the Kremlin right now, this is Russia's westernmost military outpost. It's home to the Baltic fleet, giving Moscow a permanent naval presence on one of Europe's most strategically vital bodies of water. It hooking nuclear warheads with a range that puts Berlin, Warsaw, and Stockholm all within reach. Radar installations across the region give Russia an early warning capability that covers the entire northern Europe. It's supposed to be a projection of Russian power, a dagger pointed at the heart of NATO's eastern flank. But here's what they don't show you in the military brochures. Every gram of diesel fuel that powers those baselines, every food shipment heading to the civilians who live in the shadow of those missile silos, all of it has to cross someone else's territory to get there. The fortress doesn't have its own supply chain. It did with it. And right now those neighbors are tightening the screws. But before we get into the full picture of what's happening today, let me take you back, because this situation didn't appear overnight. You need to understand how it became Russian in the first place. This territory wasn't always called Kaliningrad. For centuries, it was Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. A cultural and annual Kant was born and spent his entire life. It was a proud German city, deeply embedded in European civilization. Then came 1945. Soviet forces, Stalin annexed the territory, expelling the entire German population and replacing them with Soviet citizens. The city was renamed after Mikhail Kalinin, one of Stalin's political allies. Whatsoever. For the next 4 decades, Kaliningrad was sealed off, militarized, and integrated into the Warsaw Pact. It didn't matter that it was geographically separated from the Soviet Union, because the whole of them, Poland, Belarus, all of them were inside the bloc. Supply lines were internal. There was no problem. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, Lithuania declared independence. Belarus became its own state, though it remained close to Moscow. By 2004, both Lithuania and Poland had joined NATO and the European Union. In the span of barely a decade, political orphan. Overnight, those once internal supply lines now crossed foreign, sovereign NATO member territory. What had been a logistical convenience became a structural dependency, and to put this, it responded not by finding a solution, but by doubling down on the military buildup. More missiles, more naval assets, more radar infrastructure. And with every ruble pool supply chains that Russia could not control, the paradox is almost poetic. The more Russia militarized Kaliningrad, the more vulnerable it became. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this is a story that has been building for a radically new phase, and it started with a single announcement on October 31st. Lithuanian Railways, known as LTG, declared that starting November 21st, it would immediately halt the rail. The targeted companies were Lukoil and Rosneft, both of which had just been hit with sweeping new sanctions imposed by the United States and the United Kingdom. As reported by LRT, Lithuania's national publicist Lazauskas called the decision a reflection of Vilnius's value position and a consistent step towards strict compliance with Western sanctions restrictions. Let's talk about what those numbers actually mean. In 2024 alone, Lithuania moved 371,000 tons of Russian petroleum products, nearly all of them from Lukoil, along its rail lines to Kaliningrad. In just the first 1,000 tons had already been delivered. As reported by the new Voice of Ukraine on November 21st, that figure dropped to precisely 0. The tap was off. Here's where it gets interesting, because Lithuania, when the European Union banned the transit of Russian oil products through EU territory back in December 2022, Lithuania was granted a temporary carve-out specifically to allow humanitarian supplies to held for nearly 3 years. But when Washington and London targeted Lukoil and Rosneft directly with new sanctions this autumn, Lithuania's position became untenable. You can't honor isolating allied sanctions. Vilnius chose its allies. It always was going to. Moscow's response was predictable. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the move a latest chapter in what it described as a NATO campaign to economically strangle Russia. Lukoil issued a statement calling the disruption politically motivated. The Russian Foreign Ministry invoked the language of and officials hinted at potential retaliation, cyber operations, increased transit fees on European goods moving through Russian territory, and other forms of pressure. But here's the brutal truth about logistical reality on the ground. You can call something a hostile act as many times as you want. It won't fill a diesel tank. And that brings us to what may be Kaliningrad's most critical vulnerability. On the morning of October 24th, something genuinely bizarre happened on the Lithuanian-Belarusian border. A large helium balloon drifted across from Belarusian territory. Through a key Lithuanian radar installation, security forces discovered it was loaded with hundreds of boxes of smuggled cigarettes and a tracking device. Before the day was over, 3 more balloons had crossed the fighter jets, shut down 2 major airports for hours, and rerouted dozens of commercial flights. Whether this was a deliberate provocation, a test of Lithuanian airspace defenses, or since contested. But Lithuania didn't wait to find out. 5 days later, on October 29th, Vilnius closed 5 of its 6 major border crossings with Belarus to diplomats, passengers, and carefully screened cargo approved for Kaliningrad. Russian fuel trucks were turned away completely. The reaction was immediate. Lines of trucks backed up for miles on the Belarus, drivers burning through the very fuel they were trying to deliver. Belarus retaliated by banning all European Union trucks from using its roads, creating a knock-on chaos that left freight paralyzed. At the time, the volume of freight moving through Belarus toward Kaliningrad dropped by more than 2/3 within just a few days. Rail transits that once took a day and a half were delayed by endless documents as missing paperwork. Ferry services tried to compensate, but Baltic seaports simply couldn't absorb the volume. This is the Belarus dimension that Moscow had always counted on. If it ever caused trouble, there was always the rail corridor through Belarus, carrying over 1 million tons of goods every month. Now that corridor was effectively choked, and Russia's backup. If you're finding this analysis valuable, now is the time to subscribe to World Brief Daily. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next in this story, because it keeps evolving. Genuinely complex. The Marshal Vasilevsky is a floating storage and regasification unit, essentially a converted tanker ship that has been anchored off Kaliningrad since 2019. Moscow spent an emergency backup to pipeline gas. On paper, it is impressive. The unit is capable of processing up to 2.7 billion cubic meters of gas per year, theoretically enough to cover Kaliningrad meters, according to independent energy analyst Maxim Kudilov, cited in reporting by EA Daily. But the word theoretically is doing enormous heavy lifting in that sentence. The Marshal Vasilevsky natural gas at minus 162 degrees Celsius. Those tankers need ice-free water and reasonably calm sea conditions to dock safely. In November 2025, the breakers managed to clear a path, but only 2 shipments got through that month. Each tanker carries approximately 170,000 cubic meters of gas, enough to keep Kaliningrad operational for rough, are capped at 75% capacity to preserve emergency buffer space, meaning the effective runway is closer to a single week between deliveries. Every delay costs fuel just to keep the regasification terminal as proof of Kaliningrad's energy independence. The reality, as EA Daily noted in September 2025, is that by that point, the region had already experienced 6 separate interruptions to pipeline falling back on the Marshal Vasilevsky or drawing from underground storage. Russia wasn't testing energy independence, it was scrambling. And then there was the pipeline question, the issue that had to read closely. The Minsk-Kaliningrad interconnection is a 155-kilometer natural gas pipeline running from Belarus through Lithuania to Kaliningrad. It has been the region's private agreement governing it. A 10-year deal between Lithuania's Amber Grid operator and Russia's Gazprom was signed in December 2015. It was due to expire on December 31st, 2020. The fate of that agreement was the source of enormous tension. Lithuania had already signaled it would demand higher fees and a shorter extension. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda stated publicly that he saw this, but also made clear that any new terms would need to align with Lithuania's national interests and EU standards. As reported by RBC Ukraine, the European Commission was formally informed of the bilateral matter, but a broader EU decision. Earlier in the year, Lithuania's Prime Minister Gintautas Paluckas had explicitly said that escalating relations with Moscow, balancing act between strategic pressure and avoiding direct provocation. The stakes for Kaliningrad were existential. Heating systems, power plants, and industrial operations all depend on that. This mean coal departments. It would mean blackouts, stalled production, and a civilian population caught between Moscow's geopolitical calculations and the realities of a Baltic winter. Here's the twist. On December 29, 2025, just 2 days before the deadline, Amber Grid and Gazprom signed a new agreement. As reported by multiple outlets, including the New Voice of Ukrainers, until December 31st, 2030, the financial terms shifted dramatically. Under the old contract, Lithuania earned approximately 11 to 13 million euros annually in transit fees. In 2026 alone is set at approximately 30 million euros, more than double the previous rate. The European Commission signed off on the arrangement. Lithuania kept the gas flowing. But who holds the leverage now? Let's zoom out and look at what all of this means economically for Russia, because the cost picture is extraordinary. To keep Kaliningrad functioning amid the disruptions, moves across the Baltic by barge, by small tanker, and by whatever shipping assets can be pressed into service. Each ton of diesel now costs the Kremlin nearly twice what it cost just a year ago. The Russian finds export credits for what official budget documents describe as regional resilience costs. That is a bureaucratic phrase that translates to one thing: keeping the lights on in Kaliningrad at any price, what analysts are increasingly calling a budgetary drain. The U.S. Treasury Department's own assessment, cited in reporting by LRT, estimated that the new sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft could reduce that. That is a staggering figure, and Kaliningrad's logistical crisis is only one small piece of the broader pressure it reflects. Meanwhile, ferry traffic across the Baltic has increased by cutoff. But ferries are slow, expensive, and weather-dependent. They can't match the volume or reliability of rail freight. In winter conditions, ice and storms can halt them entirely. You cannot replace a functioning rail network with a weather-dependent ferry service and call it a supply chain. For the roughly 940,000 people who actually live in Kaliningrad, this isn't an abstraction. It's nearly 40%. Shipping is now roughly a third more expensive than it was just weeks before the disruptions. Deliveries that once took days are taking weeks. Grocery stores are struggling to maintain stock, lines at gas stations stretch around the block, and drivers idle nervously, unsure whether there will be fuel left by the time they reach the pump. Amber miners, Kaliningrad produces around 90% of fact, are losing profits as transport costs cut into every sale. Fishing crews are staying docked because diesel is too scarce and refrigeration can't be relied upon. Tourism has dried up while travel delays keep visitors away. City governments are managing tighter budgets just to keep buses running and public buildings heated. Every sector is bending under the same weight. Too few supplies and too many deeper than economics. It goes to identity. Kaliningrad has always had an uneasy sense of itself. It is a Russian city, but it sits on European soil. It is geographically closer to was built on layers of German, Prussian, and Soviet history. And for years that created something unusual. Residents could cross borders relatively freely, trade with EU neighbors, travel to... That openness bred a subtle but significant sense of difference. Kaliningrad, many of its residents felt, wasn't quite like the rest of Russia. That distinction is now being eroded. Students who once enrolled closing. Small traders who relied on cross-border commerce have gone bankrupt. Social media feeds in Kaliningrad are filling with posts about empty shelves and lights still burning brightly just across the Polish border. Leningraders, it is visible every single day. The longer this isolation deepens, the more it risks transforming a population that once looked both east and west into one that begins to question over connection. That is a political risk the Kremlin has not fully grappled with. And here's the larger irony that this story reveals. Russia built up Kaliningrad's military flank. The Iskander missiles, the Baltic fleet, the radar network, all of it was designed to signal that Russia cannot be coerced, that it holds cards that others dare not challenge, based on the assumption that supply lines would remain stable. That Lithuania and Poland, however hostile their governments might be toward Moscow, would always need to keep transit open for geography could be weaponized in Russia's favor. What 2025 revealed is that the calculation runs in the opposite direction. Lithuania doesn't need Russian transit revenue badly enough to tolerate. Poland doesn't need the economic relationship. The Baltic states, which on February 8th, 2025 completed their historic exit from the Soviet-era Brel electricity ring, synchronizing instead methodically cutting every dependency on Russian infrastructure. They were ready for this moment. Russia was not. As reported by the second line of defense analysis, the Baltic states grid-sync complete energy island for Kaliningrad, a region now operating in isolated electrical mode, cut off from external power connections. The enclave prepared for this by running autonomy tests annually are different things. In February 2025, Kaliningrad went 5 days without gas transit through Lithuania during one test of autonomous operation. The Marshal Vasilevsky and undergrounds, this is what a strategic encirclement looks like in the 21st century. It doesn't announce itself with artillery. It arrives through rail timetables, sanctions compliance announcements, and renegotiated gas. And by the time it becomes undeniable, the options for the encircled party have already narrowed dramatically. Kaliningrad is not collapsing. Let's be clear about that. The Baltic fleet still sails, but the daily rhythm of the region is fracturing. What was designed as a symbol of Russian strength now runs on fragile supply chains and constant political improvisation. The $300 million, the ferry subsidies, all of it represents a recurring cost that Moscow never anticipated and cannot easily eliminate. Military hardware, as it turns out, means very little when the fuel to real power isn't just about what you can threaten. It's about what you can sustain. And Kaliningrad is demonstrating in real time the limits of what Russia can sustain in a region it chose to shift. Zoom out even further, and the picture becomes something almost philosophical. This small, isolated exclave has become a mirror for Moscow's broader strategic miscalculation over economic integration, the assumption that European neighbors could be indefinitely coerced, the belief that energy dependence ran only one way. All of those assumptions are being quietly dismantled in a negotiated contract, one balloon incident at a time. What Königsberg survived, from Teutonic Knights to Prussian kings to Soviet annexation, it survived through trade, through connection into is something different, a fortress, a pressure point, an outpost of confrontation. And fortresses, history reminds us, only work when they can be resupplied. For Kaliningrad's nearly shadow of radar towers and missile silos, who send their children to schools built next to naval bases, who heat their homes on gas piped through a country that has just tripled the price of transit, not an abstraction. It is the price of fuel at the pump. It is the queue at the grocery store. It is the question their children are starting to ask, quietly at first and then louder. Why does living here? That question has no easy answer. But it is the question that the Kremlin will have to reckon with eventually. Because you can manage a fuel shortage with emergency credits. You can manage a broken supply chain, manage indefinitely is a population that stops believing the fortress is worth the cost. That, my friends, is the real story of Kaliningrad. Not the missiles, not the fleet. The slopes can falter on logistics. That geography can quietly humble empires. That what was meant to remind Europe of Russia's reach now reminds Russia of its own limits. We'll continue to, if you want to stay ahead of what's coming next, because this situation will keep evolving, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. Share this video with someone who wants to understand how geopolitics fuel prices, freight delays,